We are back, and we are joined once again by friend of the show, Dr. Annelle Sheline, research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute. Annelle was also at the State Department under Biden and resigned over the administration's support for the Gaza genocide. Her brief in Quincy, which is new, is called Under Primacy, or Primacy, Weapons Sales Will Always Supersede Human Rights. Annelle, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I just wanted to start here because, as I just mentioned, obviously you resigned from the State Department under Biden. We've had you on to discuss your decision on that front. But now we are in this Trump era, and there are a variety of just mass human rights abuses that the administration is engaging in. We just covered what's happening with the El Salvador gulags, but also the disappearances of people speaking out against the genocide here in this country. As someone who felt compelled enough morally to resign from your job over this, what's been your reaction to the Trump administration's escalation of these fascistic tactics?
Yeah, it is really scary. And I mean, in many ways, it's been certainly interesting to see the way that Democrats are finally speaking up about what's going on, in contrast to under Biden, where we saw much less of that. Sort of convenient now to speak up now that they're no longer in power. And in many ways, while it is certainly abhorrent what Trump has been doing, I do just want to emphasize that Biden initiated a lot of this, again, not to the level we're seeing, but in particular, things like characterizing the campus protesters as anti-Semitic, instructing the federal government to use the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, which does include criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. All of these ways that Trump is kind of building on the framework that Biden established. And while certainly Trump has gone a lot further, I think the metaphor I've heard that I found useful was that Biden cleaned and loaded the gun, and now Trump is firing it. Obviously, firing the gun is a lot more damaging than loading it, but still, Biden set up a lot of this. And so while I welcome the fact that we are starting to see a few members of Congress calling this out, and I hope increasingly they will do so, because it is becoming so apparent that this is not just about the matter of Palestine, but it's about free speech, it's about the Constitution, it's about authoritarianism in this country. And I'm a little worried that people may sort of look back with rose-colored glasses at the Biden administration and say how much better things were then, when they weren't.
Well, they were not. And I mean, what may benefit us is that even Democrats are enraged by Biden and his holding on to power in the face of this fascistic administration. Like, he doesn't have the Obama charisma that can paper over the way that Obama made many mistakes and capitulated to the right. Like, Biden is probably cooked and is likely going to be viewed as one of the worst presidents in the history of the country. I don't know. I mean, in history, but I also, who knows how history is going to respond to these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, and I don't know if you've covered this on the show, the fact that there was that YouGov/IMEU poll that found that 29% of voters who voted for Biden in 2020, didn't vote for Harris in 2024, listed Gaza as their main issue. And that was a higher percentage than people who were concerned about immigration or inflation. So they lost the White House over this, and maybe cost us American democracy. So I just hope that as Democrats are thinking about, if we're able to have functioning elections in the future, the fact that supporting genocide is not a winning political platform.
It's I hope so too, but we interviewed Representative Pramila Jayapal maybe a month or 2 months ago, and I asked her this very question. Have Democrats reckoned with how their support for genocide has particularly harmed their brand with young people? I'm using my example as somebody who was inspired by Obama's anti-Iraq war stance, and that's how I first gotten interested in politics. And she said honestly no. And that's the thing where it really just strikes a chord with me. And now this kind of bleeds into what you wrote about, like the McCarthyite era also first was brought to the fore by Democrats who thought that they could do it in a more managed way. We can repress this kind of left-wing political speech, the commies. Now it's the, anti-Semites on campus, meaning people outraged about genocide. We can do it in a more managed, targeted way. And then the right inevitably takes the mantle, and it's authoritarian crackdown time. We execute the Rosenbergs. We blackball anybody with loose ties to communism. That's what a mirror of what we're seeing right now.
Exactly. And, as you said in the report, a big part of the argument I make is looking into the historical record of the fact that, it's not just Trump or, it's not just sort of U.S. foreign policy since World War II has been driven by this imperative towards military primacy, one crucial aspect of which is weapon sales, and that under this overarching framework, the United States is never going to prioritize human rights. And in the report, I wasn't introducing a lot of information that was not previously public. I mean, I'm not allowed to do that as a former government employee, but it's been interesting because I think it's tapping into something that people themselves are thinking, and this awareness of our image of ourselves as Americans and this idea of sort of American exceptionalism. Certainly, this is a very pervasive idea inside the State Department or inside U.S. government, that the U.S. is a force for good in the world, that the U.S. upholds human rights. As I say in the report, I mean, that myth lies buried under the rubble of Gaza. And I think for many people around the world, they no longer held that assumption. And I imagine many of your listeners also didn't hold that assumption, but so many Americans still sort of believe that. And I do think it is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain that fiction. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's, I think, a good place for us to dive in now is let's start as broadly as we can. When did the era of U.S. primacy begin, as you understand it? And when did that get tied into the military-industrial complex piece?
Yeah. So I'm partly basing this on a former colleague here at Quincy, who's now at Carnegie, Stephen Wertheim's excellent book called Tomorrow the World, where as a historian, he traces this and kind of the aftermath of World War II, this decision, partly informed by the experience of the U.S. economy going through sort of military industrialization to fight World War II, and how that helped move the U.S. economy out of the Great Depression, and then the choice to sort of perpetuate that. And at the time, this was motivated by Cold War logics, which, as you mentioned, later morphed and, was reflected in McCarthyism and the sort of boogeyman of communism writ large. And as time went on, as the military-industrial complex grew to such an extent that you had people like President Eisenhower himself, a military cautioning the American people about the influence of the defense industry, of kind of the ways in which this would drive our foreign policy. Then I go through the fact that in the 1970s, there was a huge expansion in the weapons production and weapons sales around the world, which corresponded to the fact that this was the first time that Congress actually said that, no, actually human rights should be part of our consideration when we are establishing our foreign policy, and linking weapons sales to human rights in the law. Unfortunately, that law has never been applied, because that would undermine such a core aspect of how we conduct our foreign policy, which is often driven by military sales, by security assistance writ large, which includes weapon sales. So we have other law. I go through this in the report, the fact that there are other laws on the books, things like the Leahy laws, which would limit security assistance to a specific unit of a military that engages in gross human rights violations. You have 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which stipulates that if a country is blocking humanitarian aid, they're no longer eligible for security assistance. But all of these are kind of piecemeal below the broader law, which says if a government has engaged in gross violations of human rights, they're no longer eligible for U.S. security assistance. And yet that law has never been applied because that would undermine so much of how we conduct our foreign policy.
And I want to get to Israel specifically and the Middle East in just a second, but can you talk about the origin of these efforts to say, okay, we'll sell a bunch of weapons, but this came about in the 70s, as you write. Let's at least give consideration to human rights, or at least that was the stated purpose of the laws.
Exactly. So yeah, the timing is interesting. It came about kind of as the country was reacting to Nixon's imperial presidency and then Ford and the lack of accountability and the Vietnam War, and grappling with what it was that the United States had pursued in Vietnam. But in particular, it was actually the public recognition or realization of the fact that the US government had been involved in overthrowing Salvador Allende of Chile and installing Pinochet as a brutal dictator. That got a lot of attention. And it was in that context that you had activists, various groups pushing for this idea that then Congress did legislate that the United States should not sell weapons to a country engaged in gross violations of human rights. And this is why the human rights reports exist. And one thing that was ironic is while I was at the State Department working in the Human Rights Office, a huge part of our time was putting together these human rights reports. There was never any acknowledgement of the idea that the reason Congress mandated these reports in the first place was to determine a country's eligibility for weapons sales. Instead, the reports were sort of seen as an end in and of themselves, that they're useful for NGOs, which is, that may well be. But the original reason Congress required them had to do with weapon sales, and yet they've never been used for that purpose. So, for me, as someone who had gone into state and was working on this, to then come out and look more into the history of it and to just develop a better understanding of what the law actually says here, I mean, in many ways, it's not that surprising. And maybe, shifting to Israel, because Israel is such a glaring example of where we have actually relatively clear laws on the books that we simply ignore. But that's also the case for so many other countries. You think of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Egypt. I mean, I focus on the Middle East, but obviously it's not limited to the Middle East, where the U.S. government is happy to call out the human rights abuses of adversaries like Iran or Syria because we're not endangering weapon sales to those countries. But the State Department or the U.S. government is much less interested in publicly calling out human rights abuses by the Israelis, by the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, because that might necessitate legal measures and a shift in policy. But it's seen as not actually conducive to U.S. national security because these partnerships are seen as more important, especially now in this context of great power competition, which was a leading motivator for the Biden administration, arguably still for Trump, although under Trump, because he's all over the place, it's less coherent.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes hard to parse. But clearly, I mean, China is still a major concern for Trump as it was for Biden.
Yeah, and we have never successfully, since the passing of these laws, as you write, successfully blocked weapon sales with these laws. So this is window dressing, or treated as such by the Senate, and that has to do with that broad industry, the military-industrial complex, how much it is a major part of our economy, and Israel. Let's pull up this second chart here that Annelle has in her paper. This is figure 2, looking at U.S. military aid to Israel starting in 1959 through 2024. you'll be able to see how it jumps off the screen after the October 7th attacks to 17.9 billion. But you can see how we really did maintain like just a baseline level of support for Israel from the 90s on. I mean, there's some short increases, and you can see that in conjunction with the two wars that the United States started in the Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq. But that line goes way, way up. I mean, Israel's support peaked at 14 billion. And that was what, 1980? Now it's at nearly 18 billion in the wake of October 7th and to help support their genocide of Palestinians. Can you talk a little bit about Israel's role in maintaining primacy for the United States? What do people view Israel as from a foreign policy strategic perspective? And like, we've speculated on the show about its strategic placement in the Suez, the fact that we need somebody in the Middle East who's directly aligned with us, functioning as basically our colony in the Middle East, because we don't want China to have influence in that area, and we use military force to beat them back, basically. But what is your understanding of it? How do people in government view Israel's role in making sure that the United States is still the world superpower, which, by the way, isn't happening anymore and is like 20 years out of date and is never returning?
Well, I mean, when it does come to military spending and our military footprint, that is the one place where sort of the U.S. maintains this sort of superpower status. And also in weapons sales, the U.S. has been the leading arms dealer of the world since 1950, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon.
Right.
I mean, as far as the perception of Israel, I think that this is so often used as a justification for U.S., the sort of unconditional and exorbitant levels of support the U.S. provides to Israel. But the U.S. has a massive presence in the Middle East. We have bases all over. I mean, you think also at the peak of the U.S. presence in the region during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and just, the vast numbers. So like, whether or not Israel was part of that equation, like, it really didn't matter. The U.S. mobilized to invade Iraq, mobilized to invade Afghanistan. In many ways, this notion that kind of Israel is the unsinkable aircraft carrier, is what I've heard some people refer to it as. But again, the U.S. has massive numbers of troops stationed around the region in countries that are very happy to host us, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain. I mean, you think about the massive military footprint in the Middle East. In contrast, Israel is an issue of domestic policy. The power of the Israel lobby is informed by the American Jewish community, but much more by the American evangelical community, who operate under the biblically informed belief that the Jews need to return, need to be present in Israel for the Messiah to return. I mean, and
a majority of them die in that instance. I feel like I just wish one reporter would ask, like, I'm sorry to cut you off here, but like, I was watching CNN, God help me, last night, and Scott Jennings is debating this guy about anti-Semitism wearing the Israeli hostage pin. It's like, could someone have the balls to say, I don't know what his religion is, but what is your stake in it? Because if Republicans have to explain this, if they have to actually get into the nitty-gritty of it, you are calling for like mass extermination of Jews in your biblical end time prophecy.
Right. And they're generally pretty open about, this is what the Bible says. I mean, what's wild, and I may have brought this up before because it's still just, I find it mind-boggling, is that even people like Bill Clinton stating these kinds of talking points, the idea that, well, God gave them this land. And it's like, are we basing our foreign policy on like the Bible? Like, is that really what you want? Because if we're going back to that, that is completely contradictory to our entire constitution. Like, that is not what this country was set up to be. And so just the ways in which Israel is sort of this unconditional support, that insane level of support that graph shows, which again only goes up to October of last year and doesn't account for money sent since then, including under the Biden administration. And credit to Stephen Semler for that excellent graph that we used. That it's sort of justified by like, well, this is necessary to our foreign policy, when really it's just a matter of domestic policy, which is somewhat similar to understanding the power of the military industrial complex. Or even, as you said, weapons production or military defense production is such an important part of our economy. But in fact, it's not actually that big. It's just that they have a very powerful lobby. And so when you have these massive wars, the CEOs of these companies, the shareholders of these companies make so much money, but they maintain this myth that this is a core, this is core to America's, labor. If you support labor, if you support American labor, you have to support weapons production, which is really not true. And in part, just because when you actually break it down and look at things like where is weapons production happening, these districts are more likely to deal with higher levels of poverty. Like, these are not jobs that are kind of bringing people up by their bootstraps. And if you look dollar for dollar at something like, if the US government invested in something like education or green energy or healthcare, dollar for dollar, as much as they sort of our industrial policy invests in the military industrial complex and supporting, subsidizing weapons production, the outcome, like the return on investment, would be so much higher for our economy as well as for these workers themselves. So again, it's this sort of myth that the US has to continue to support Israel because it's necessary for our approach to the Middle East and our ability to sort of maintain our military footprint in the Middle East, which is nonsense. And this idea that the US, that it's in our US national interest to continue to provide, now $1 trillion a year to DoD and defense contractors to manufacture these weapons, because that's good for the American worker. Like, both of those are false. And so, and that kind of, both of them are also still justified under this notion that without the United States, human rights would fall by the wayside. It is up to the United States to hold other countries accountable for human rights, or that it is up to U.S. military power. Without U.S. military primacy, China and Russia would be in charge, and clearly they don't care about human rights. And just like, well, clearly our country doesn't care about human rights. So
who believes that anymore? Besides, I don't know, like people's parents.
People's parents, so many people at the State Department. And, maybe this report was really just intended for my former colleagues. But this notion of American exceptionalism, I do think, motivates people, to continue to do this work. And, for all that I'm shocked and horrified by everything the Trump administration is doing, I do think it may be useful for stripping away some of these illusions and making it harder for people to continue to lie to themselves about the role the U.S. plays in the world. Right. Which under Biden, so many people still kind of did, and I think would have continued to do if we'd had a President Harris.
Yeah, I mean, and that is, I guess, the cost of enlightening people is not worth the bodies. I mean, I can't make that calculation, but if we're looking for ways to move forward, that's one of them, right? And I guess that's where we can talk more about how do we democratize this stuff. And it's just when we're selling democracy to the public, people feel like there's no democratic process about our foreign policy, and they're correct. Like, so when Trump talks about the deep state, and he makes it about, oh, woe is me. But the real deep state is the stuff that covers up our human rights atrocities that we fund across the world as the number one weapons exporter. Can we just put up even this third graph here? Just because this, if you scroll down, this just shows another, that one with the map. Sorry, I should have said map. You put this out there, just the sheer scope of where the United States has sold arms. You see every country basically there, except for some in Africa and Greenland, but that functions almost as like a military base
Right.
already. We have a significant
military. We sold them to Denmark, so like technically,
right. Right, like what there's the exactly, but that's there it is. Iran, China, Russia, and then that's basically it. That's it. And Yemen, is that what I'm seeing there? No, we've sold
Somalia.
Somalia. Geez, I'm bad at maps. I shouldn't have even taken a guess. I'm not a great visual learner. Anyway, so I love having these because it does help me just think about it. Like Australia, you see all over the place. That's where we've sold arms just since the start of 2001. This is our effort to maintain primacy, even though as we're losing economic power to China, and Trump seems to be escalating that. Just your thoughts, Annelle.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something that I remember speaking with someone on the National Security Council about the idea that the only place the U.S. is able to maintain, our status as number one is weapons sales. And so we just have to double down on that, as opposed to saying, well, actually, no, as the global order becomes more multipolar, it is increasingly in America's interest to avoid unnecessary wars. Something like the war in Iraq that we foolishly, under false pretenses, engaged in was somewhat possible. The reason we did something like that was because as kind of the global hegemon after the Cold War, we were capable of doing that in a way that now we just can't really make these wars of choice are so much more costly, and arguably they were extremely costly at that time too, but in a way that Americans were still kind of able to ignore them, even though increasingly I do think that this is part of what Trump has tapped into, is the idea that Americans are tired of these endless unnecessary wars, which I hope seems to be informing the reason he's willing to engage in talks with Iran about a possible.
That's encouraging, because it's almost a blessing in disguise that the Biden administration didn't re-engage, because Trump would have scrapped it anyway, because he just cares about they could just copy paste the JCPOA into an email and print it out and have him sign it, and he would declare victory, and that would be amazing for all of us.
Totally. That's a very good point. Yeah, if Biden had actually just kind of snapped his fingers and re-entered, which he could have done the way he, re-entered the Paris Accords. But you're right that we would have been.
Well, he's a Zionist, so that's the problem, and that's where Obama's probably best achievement, in my estimation, was the Iran nuclear deal, because we now know, looking back, what he was facing with the Israel lobby. And we saw Netanyahu try to put public pressure on Obama at the time with that PowerPoint presentation with all that false information about how Iran was cheating on the deal, which wasn't happening. And Obama didn't cave. Biden didn't re-enter because he didn't agree with Obama.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But backing up to your point about the lack of democracy in U.S. foreign policy, I mean, this is also a big part of what Quincy tries to do. We have a whole program called Democratizing Foreign Policy, which is partly just about tracing the influence of dark money in our, in Congress and in foreign policy decision making, especially foreign lobbies. But I do think that, for all that it has taken a genocide to get us here, which is appalling, I do think that people are waking up to some of this. And you think about, the ways that for so long the Israel lobby, in cahoots with sort of the defense lobby, were able to maintain this bipartisan, unconditional support for Israel and to maintain the censorship. Even someone like me studying, getting a PhD focused on the Middle East, I was warned away from studying Palestine because it was described as a career killer by a scholar who studied Palestine, who was able to do it and come through and have tenure on the other side, but it was like, it's just not worth it. And so the fact that they were able to maintain that for so long without kind of the coercion showing, and that now they have to show like what it is actually that maintains that censorship of support for Palestine. And it is police brutality. It is deporting people who express solidarity with Palestine. It is taking away funding, defunding universities that provide like Middle East studies program, professor, people like Rosie Bashir at Harvard, who doesn't even study this stuff, but has like lost her tenured job. Like, again, I'm an academic, so I'm especially alarmed by the assaults on universities and academic freedom, but also just the assaults on freedom of speech writ large, or the millions of dollars poured into the primaries to oust Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush from Congress. And that Democrats didn't speak up for them is just appalling. But I do think that because they are losing the narrative, and because actually, at this point, the pro-Palestine side has the numbers, but they are intimidating people. The Trump administration is scaring people. People are especially non-citizens are understandably unwilling to speak up as maybe they used to be. And so I do think it is up to American citizens to speak up about this. And again, it's not just about Palestine, it's about free speech writ large, because we know that it's just going to get worse. This is what authoritarian governments do all over the world. We know Trump is a bully. And if you stand up to a bully, he's less likely to come after you again. But if you show that, oh yeah, okay, I can be intimidated by this, it's just going to get worse. So I hope that people are not losing hope, because I do think that this is the time to stand up and speak out, again, whether it's about Palestine or just about the assault on our constitutional rights, including the rights of non-citizens. Like, freedom of speech isn't limited to citizens. It's just, Congress shall not make a law abridging the freedom of speech.
Right.
So I know it can be really disheartening for people, and it is frightening, and I recognize that, but I do think those of us who are citizens have an obligation to stand up and to try to slow down this slide into autocracy.
Absolutely. Lastly, before I let you go, Annelle, just back to the Iran news and the fact that the Trump administration is re-engaging in these talks under Steve Witkoff. What's your impression of him? Because it's not as bad as I thought so far. Remember, he kind of strong-armed Israel to get that ceasefire done, the fake ceasefire that's just lasted for a short period of time, but it was more than what was achieved previously, at least for a short period of time. And the posture of we're America, you're the client state, versus Biden's weakness when it came to Netanyahu is something that's different. Witkoff went to the Middle East. I think it was during a Jewish holiday, or it was a time off, and he said, "You're going to meet with me no matter what, because we're the United States." Right. And now it seems like these Iran talks are not going terribly. What's your impression of what this guy's deal is?
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone had asked, do we just need more Steve Witkoffs? And my response was no. It's not him. He's, Trump is empowering him to speak for Trump and the US government on things like, we expect you, Netanyahu, to abide by the terms of the ceasefire in order for Trump to have his inauguration. And, we're not going to have dead babies coming through the headlines to the extent that they do.
Well, they're PR people. Trump's is a savant at one thing, and it's public relations.
Exactly. And, so not only did he clearly not want that distracting from his moment of glory, but also to show that he could achieve what Biden hadn't, which was, Biden for months saying we're working tirelessly towards a ceasefire, never actually getting there. And then Trump being able to come in and, as you said, insisting, no, you're going to meet with us and you're going to stick to this. Unfortunately, I think just the political will evaporated. Trump wanted this mostly to show that he could get it when Biden couldn't, but he wasn't committed to actually maintaining that. And this, I think, speaks to, again, like the influence of very, very wealthy Zionist donors, people like Miriam Adelson and others that have given him hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. But on Iran, similarly, the fact that Trump is, again, tapping into this, to Americans' frustration with endless and unnecessary wars in the Middle East, so not wanting to do Netanyahu's bidding to get to fight Iran on Israel's behalf. And in general, like that meeting when Netanyahu and Trump, when Netanyahu just recently was back in Washington, and Netanyahu was hoping to get Trump to lift the tariffs on Israel, which he didn't do. He wanted Trump to speak out against Turkey, and instead Trump said, no, like Erdogan's my buddy, and you need to be reasonable.
Yep.
Unfortunately, on Gaza, Netanyahu continues to do and get whatever he wants with full U.S. support, including maintaining a full siege. Nothing has gotten into Gaza since March 2nd, and people are starving. And Israel is successfully implementing its policy of either killing all the people in Gaza or forcing them to leave. And, there's that new branch of the Israeli government set up to facilitate people's departure. So I am heartened by the fact that Trump is not willing to bow to Netanyahu the way Biden was. But unfortunately on Gaza, he seems to be perfectly fine with the genocide.
Yeah, and I think he sees it as a real estate opportunity. I legitimately think that. And so he also doesn't respect, if people are poor, he can't empathize with them. Like, an immiserated, he'll side with, he's drawn to people in power. It's why Netanyahu's not getting what he wants with the Erdogan thing, because Trump's inspired by Erdogan in the same way he's inspired by Bukele, by Orban in Hungary, by Putin in Russia. Like, he likes these kinds of people, and so I think he's disgusted by the Palestinians, probably because he perceives them as weak because of their victims.
Yeah. And, and I do think that I don't know what it will take to get him to see that differently, other than Americans making clear that they reject this, because I do think that Trump is sensitive to public sentiment. And so to the extent that people speak out against this, and I've been heartened to see prominent Christian commentators on social media posting, horrifying images of children in Gaza, just the way that people are still paying attention. My hope is that there are enough people on the right who maybe I don't agree with on any number of issues, but on killing children, we can agree. We don't want the U.S. sending billions of dollars, don't want our money, our taxpayer dollars, today's tax day, going to kill innocent children in Gaza.
Yep.
So, for me, and at Quincy, which is an organization where we try to work with the right and the left against unnecessary U.S. military interventions, trying to reach out to those on the right, which I do think writ large, I know it's hard. We're a very polarized country. I get it, not wanting to talk to your crazy aunt or whatever who's a Trumper.
But yeah,
but dead children, if we can't agree.
We've shown this chart from Pew. We've shown this chart from Pew now 6 times or something in the last few weeks, that Republicans from 2022 to 2025, ages 18 to 49, there's been a 15-point shift in negative views of Israel. But thank you, Matt, for oh, that's not the right one. Close though. It's the one on negative views of Israel have risen, and then you see that it's now 71% of Democrats aged 18 to 49 have a negative view, and 69% of Democrats lean Democrats overall. But that shift for Republicans, it's basically stayed the same. If you're an older Republican and you're 50 years old, you love Israel. You know, they like the ethno-state supremacist part and the killing of Muslims part. But that's significant. 15-point shift from 18 to 49. And Candace Owens is like one of the top political podcasts in the country. I am concerned about anti-Semitism. Like, I'm deeply, deeply concerned about that. And how do we appeal to the right on the basis of not wanting to kill children? I'm more comfortable going at it with the Dave Smith libertarian thing about our tax dollars than going to Candace Owens. Because, like, I genuinely think there's starting to be some real anti-Jewish hatred on the right, that not that there wasn't before, but in particularly like on this issue in particular on Israel.
Right. Well, and this goes back to some of what we were saying earlier of, you know, when you have kind of the Zionists and the evangelicals on the same page, but also you think about Israel's outreach to the far right in Europe, for example, or people like Viktor Orban, these extreme anti-Semites coming out of the tradition of the Nazis and the other fascistic parties that murdered 6 million Jews.
The AfD in Germany. Right.
Exactly. And yet that Israel is willing to ally itself with them, or the Netanyahu government is willing. And it's useful for them as well, because they can say, well, you mean Israel likes us? How could we be anti-Semitic? So it is deeply concerning, but at the same time, when you have anti-Semitic being thrown around the same way, you know, sort of anti-communist, you know, the ways in which these terms start to lose their meaning, or even the notion of like a terrorist, the way, you know, the Biden administration, or the Biden, probably they did too, but I'm thinking of the Trump administration referring to several of these people who were mistakenly deported as terrorists, or even Bukele saying that yesterday. These words start to lose their meaning, and something like anti-Semitism remains a huge problem. And to treat it seriously, and to be able to recognize it for what it when it actually is, you know, a hatred of Jewish people, as opposed to legitimate criticism of a government engaging in war crimes, atrocities, and genocide, and otherwise violating international law as well as U.S. laws, and criticizing those policies. Those are two different things. Then when you conflate them, you're undermining the reality, you know, the need to actually be serious about, we have to be careful of the ease with which the world and Europe and, you know, European-derived societies have historically, it's been very easy to sort of go after the Jewish people and target them and blame them. And we've seen that for centuries.
Well, exactly. So it's concerning. I mean, all of it, we're in dark times, but as always, I appreciate you coming on, Annelle. You can check out her work at the Quincy Institute, including this particular brief, which is a great read. It's like 27, 28 pages. It's called Under Primacy, Weapon Sales Will Always Supersede Human Rights, and you can find it on the Quincy Institute website and on your social media. Annelle Sheline, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for all the work that you do tirelessly to into all this.
Well, thank you, Annelle. Always appreciate your work, and good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.